fact that there was a cold-blooded killer in their midst never crossed the minds of McCarthy residents until it was too late. In 1983, Les and Flo Heglin's home in McCarthy, Alaska, was the gathering spot where the 22 residents of the Kennecott-McCarthy area waited for the weekly mail plane. Now, the Heglins lived near this small airstrip where these planes would land, and not only did they offer their hospitality, but even built an addition onto their front porch where they left uncollected mail and groceries so nearby residents could drop by at their convenience to, pick up their mail. Now, the Heglins owned the only two-way radio in the area strong enough to communicate with the outside world, and they relayed daily weather reports to the Federal Aviation Administration office in Cordova. Now, the Heglin house was more than just a place for residents to sit and wait for the plane to arrive. Except for the mail plane pilot, the Heglins were the McCarthy residents' lone link to civilization. And Tuesday, March 1st, 1983, was Mail Day. Now, McCarthy and Kennecott are located 4 miles from each other in the middle of Wrangler St. Elias National Park and Preserve, which is about the size of West Virginia, and the temperature fluctuates from 50 degrees below zero in the winter to about 90 degrees in the summer. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, the richest concentration of copper ever mined was discovered in the mountains above Kennecott. Now, the town of Kennecott was developed as a place for the miners to live, while McCarthy was developed as a place for the miners to play. Now, by the 1930s, most of the ore was gone, and Kennecott and McCarthy became ghost towns. The railroad track that had been used to transport the ore soon fell into disrepair and became the McCarthy Road. Now, this road begins where the pavement ends in Chitina, 61 miles to the west. And by the time it reached 1983, this road was nearly impassable. Now, residents of this area were mostly stranded during the long winter of 1983, and they were dependent upon and look forward to their Tuesday mail plane. In 1983, McCarthy had no running water, no telephones, no electricity, except for the power provided by individual generators that were placed throughout. Now, the independent souls who called this remote area home had little contact with the outside world, so the weekly gathering to wait for the mail plane was a way to talk and share news. Now, on February 28th, the night before Mail Day in Kennecott, 4 miles north of the McCarty airstrip, 29-year-old Chris Richards played a board game with his neighbor, 39-year-old Lewis Hastings. Now, Lewis was an unemployed computer programmer who had moved to Alaska from California in 1980 and had only lived in the Kennecott area for about a year. Now, according to Richards, the evening was unremarkable, just a friendly game between two neighbors. Now, the following morning, as Richards cooked breakfast, Hastings again appeared at his front door. So Richards assumed Hastings was on his way to meet for the mail plane, and he pushed open the door and invited Hastings in for a little bit of coffee, and then Richards turned his back to the door while he continued cooking his meal. A moment later, Richards felt something strike his right cheek, shattering his glasses. So he immediately ducked his head and then felt an object hit his head. Now, he turned toward Hastings and saw the other man walking toward him with his rifle held high, ready to fire again. Richards grabbed Hastings, and then they began to struggle while Richards screamed at Hastings to stop shooting.
And that's when Hastings said, "Look, you're already dead. If you'll just quit fighting, I'll make it easy for you."
So at this point, Richards, he's fumbling for a knife from the sink, and he stabs Hastings in the left upper chest and right near the leg. Richards then just runs and fled from the cabin into the waist-deep snow, wearing only socks, one slipper, one t-shirt, and light corduroy pants. Now, to remind you, the temperature in Kennecott that morning was 10 degrees. Now, while Hastings was kind of tracking him and, firing shots at him, Richards fought his way 3/4 of a mile up a steep hill to an unoccupied cabin where he found boots, a parka, and snowshoes. He then staggered 1/10 of a mile to the southwest to the cabin of Tim and Amy Nash. Now, the surprise killings already, I'm telling you, when I read this, it was like a movie plot. So stay tuned right now. And if you like it so far, please hit that subscribe button. And more importantly, hit that like button because it means a lot. But seriously, guys, this one is like a movie. Here we go. So the Nashes were this young couple who had just gotten married on Christmas Day. And after a long honeymoon, they had returned to the Kennecott area 2 weeks earlier. Now, Tim and Amy bandaged Richard's wounds up as Richard told them exactly what happened. Now, since Hastings appeared to be on his way to McCarthy, where area residents would soon be gathering to meet for the mail plane, Richards and the Nashes decided to arm themselves and head to the runway and to the Heglin's home to warn the others about Hastings. Meanwhile, while this is going on, 52-year-old Maxine Edwards left her husband at home while she crossed the frozen Kennecott River and proceeded to the Heglin's house to await for the mail plane. So, Flo Heglin, who was 58, and Les, who was 64, had lived in McCarthy since 1967 and were considered the unofficial postmasters of the area residents. So you could say that the Heglins were the heart of McCarthy, and they provided a foundation for the independent loners who called the area home. Now, if any area resident wanted to send a message to a friend or relative, then they needed to contact one of the McCarthy residents with an urgent message. Now, it was the Heglins who sent and received these communications on their sideband radio. So the Heglins in their home were central to the loosely knit community of residents within a 50-mile radius of McCarthy. Now, back at their home in Kennecott, the Nashes bundled Richards into a sled and towed it behind their snow machine as they sped toward McCarthy and the airstrip. And when they reached the airstrip, they met Gary Green, the pilot and guide. Now, Green was another pilot who was there at the airstrip, and he was just, cleaning off his plane. And when he heard their story, he told them he had seen Hastings about 20 minutes earlier heading towards the Heglin's house. So at this point, Tim Nash volunteered to go and check on the Heglins, while Green warmed up his plane in preparation to fly Richards to Glenalyn, 40 minutes away from medical care. Now, Green said he would contact the troopers and request their assistance as well. So as Green was, loading Richards into the plane, Amy Nash saw her husband running down the airstrip toward them. He had just been to the Heglin's house, where he'd smelled the acrid aroma of gun smoke and had seen blood spattered all over the interior of the house. Tim obviously believed that the Heglins were dead from this and said that when he walked into the kitchen, he saw Hastings standing on the back porch. Nash fired at Hastings but missed. And when Hastings returned fire, he struck Nash in the right leg. So the Nashes told Green to just go, and they made the fateful decision to stay at that airstrip to warn the others. Now, once Green took off, he radioed the incoming mail plane and told the pilot not to land at McCarthy. He then contacted the Alaska State Troopers in Glenalyn and reported the situation. So now, while Tim and Amy are waiting in the freezing morning air, Hastings followed a dog sled trail through the thick brush back to the airstrip. He crawled up a large mound of plowed snow across the runway from the Nashes and fired 10 rounds at the newlyweds who stood 250 yards away from him. I mean, 250 yards, you gotta think that's 750 feet. And as he was firing, he then continued to walk until he got about 50 feet away from their bodies. And then he fired 2 more shots and then continued to approach, firing 2 final shots into their heads. And then he dragged their bodies to the top of the snowbank across the runway from where they had died in an attempt to hide them in deeper snow. Now, soon after Hastings climbed the snowbank, two more area residents, Harley King and Donna Byram, arrived at the north end of the airstrip on King's snow machine. Harley King, 61 years old, and his wife Jo had lived on their homestead 15 miles west of McCarthy since 1966. Now, Jo was a well-known bush pilot and flight instructor that had flown her plane to Anchorage and was waiting for the weather to improve before flying back to McCarthy. So she was not home that fateful day. But her husband had agreed to give Donna Byram, 32 years old, a ride to the airstrip, and Byram, who lived between the King's home and McCarthy, was planning to fly out on the mail plane. So Byram at this time saw these large blotches of blood on the snow-covered airstrip and then spotted Hastings standing right on the snowbank. And then as they approached closer, Hastings opened fire on them. Byram was standing on the sled behind the snow machine, and she saw bullets hit the machine and King. One bullet hit Byram in the upper right arm, and King drove the snow machine as fast as he could towards the south, away from Hastings. But one of Hastings' shots had broken his leg, and he soon lost control. So the snow machine crashed and threw King and Byron to the runway near the path leading to the Hegland's home. Now, at this point, Byram tried to load King back onto the sled, but Hastings was just quickly approaching. So King told her, he couldn't move and urged her to go to save herself. And after a moment's pause and hesitation, Byram fled toward the Hegland's home. And as she ran, she heard two shots and knew that was King, and now he's dead. So when she reached the Hegland's house, she saw the front door had been kicked in. So she ran to the greenhouse and hid outside. And as she huddled there, literally shivering, she heard Hastings approach, calling out,
"One not dead, one not dead."
And she held her injured arm and fought to stay quiet. Now, at this point, she was certain that she was about to die. She heard Hastings' footsteps on the porch and knew he would soon find her. But then, he abruptly turned around and sped off on the Nash's snow machine. Hastings headed west on the McCarthy Road, where the troopers from Glen Allen easily intercepted him by helicopter. Hastings literally waved to the troopers when they landed and told them he was Chris Richards and explained that Lou Hastings had gone berserk and was shooting up McCarthy. The troopers knew Richards was already in Glen Allen though, and this man fit the description of Lou Hastings, so they arrested Hastings without incident. So now with Hastings, handcuffed and restrained in the helicopter, the troopers continued to McCarthy, where they found the bodies of Tim and Amy Nash and Harley King on the runway. They were all dead from gunshot wounds, with final kill shots to each of their heads. Then, inside the Hegland's house, the troopers discovered the bodies of Les and Flo Hegland and their neighbor Maxine Edwards, stacked in the bedroom. A bloody, fur-covered silencer sat on the nightstand right beside the bodies. Troopers found the injured Byram outside the greenhouse and helped her to the helicopter. She was then forced, though, to share the ride to Glen Allen with the man who had murdered her neighbors and had tried to kill her. So I'm sure some of you want a reason, and luckily, I have one. So when people ask why did Louis Hastings go on this murderous rampage and kill his neighbors, well, the reason is nearly as bizarre as the crimes themselves. Hastings was actually an intelligent computer programmer who had worked at Stanford University in the late 1970s. But like many people who moved to Alaska, he left the overdeveloped area where he lived in California with dreams of starting a new life in the unspoiled wilderness of Alaska. At first, he and his wife, they settled in Anchorage, and he started a computer service business out of his house. But by 1982, his business and marriage had failed. And that's when he began to spend more and more time at his cabin in Kennecott. Now, Alaska's economy was booming in 1983 due to the construction of the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline that carries oil from Prudhoe Bay south to the port of Valdez on Prince William Sound. So the state, at this point was flush with money and in the midst of a construction boom. Now, Hastings hated the pipelines and related development that it had created, and he felt that the state's newfound prosperity would ruin his lifestyle that he had dreamed of when he moved to Alaska. So it became his mission to destroy this pipeline. Now, Hastings had plans to arrive in McCarthy before the mail plane and kill anyone who showed up to meet for the Tuesday plane. But that was only part one of his plan. Next, he would kill the mail plane pilot and actually steal the plane. He then planned to fly to a pump station near the pipeline about 80 miles away west of McCarthy, where he would land and rig the plane to take off again without him in it. Then he planned to steal a fuel truck and ram the pipeline while shooting at it. This action, he believed, would badly damage the pipeline, but he hoped that the oil, since it would be in the cold weather temperature, wouldn't do too much to damage the environment as well. Then, after rupturing the pipeline, he then believed that the fuel truck would burst into flames and char his body beyond recognition. He hoped people would actually think that he had been murdered in McCarthy with the other residents, and his family would never know he was a murderer who had committed suicide in the end. Now, Lewis Hastings brutally massacred 6 people on March 1st, 1983, because he believed murdering his neighbors was a necessary first step in his brilliant plan to preserve the Alaskan wilderness. Les and Flo Heglin, Maxine Waters, Tim and Amy Nash, and Harley King died in the McCarthy massacre, and Chris Richards and Donna Byram were injured. The judge sentenced Hastings to 634 years in prison. And there's no better news, because there is a sad footnote to this tragic story. Chris Richards, who was one of the surviving residents of McCarthy, was considered a hero because of his swift actions that had saved more people from being killed in the 1983 massacre, died when his Kennecott cabin burned down 1 week before Christmas in 2001. And after his death, many who knew Richards said Hastings had finally claimed his 7th victim. Richards never recovered physically or mentally from the massacre, and in later years, survivor's guilt, depression, and alcoholism plagued him. And according to those who knew him, at the time of his death, he was trying to give up alcohol and was suffering from hallucinations. The McCarthy, Kennecott area is now a popular tourist destination. Now that's the end of the story, but before you leave, please say a quick prayer for all 7 people that were taken by this senseless action.